We'd like to welcome you to our 3:30 presentation by Elder Tanner on finding your Catholic relatives on Findmypast. And we'd like to thank him for the time he takes to prepare and the time he takes to be here with us and answer your questions and do his presentations. They're unique and he's very knowledgeable, and we appreciate that. So we'll turn the time over to him.
Well, today, as he mentioned, we're going to talk about finding your Catholic relatives on Findmypast. And this takes a little bit of an explanation because we're talking about Catholic relatives in the United States, as well as over in Great Britain, where Findmypast is located. So it's kind of an interesting situation that's developed over the past few years. So Findmypast is a British company. It's actually based out of Scotland with billions of digitized records. It's one of the 4 largest online genealogical websites. It primarily focuses on Great Britain, but if you think in terms of the British Empire, it includes all of the British Empire countries. So when you're talking about this particular website, then they have India and South Africa and Australia, New Zealand and Canada and the United States, and because we were once a British colony and therefore part of their collection. So there's lots of things that you have to think about when you begin doing research, because you can't make assumptions about what a website might or might not have. You need to go out there and explore it and see whether or not it has the information that you're interested in. And there's a pretty straightforward way to do that, and that is to go to the catalog. Each of these websites, large websites, has essentially what you could call a catalog. On Family Search, it's called a catalog. On Ancestry, it's called a card catalog. And on Findmypast, it's all collections. And so you just sort of have to look around. On MyHeritage, it's called the collection, the collection viewer, where you can see all the collections, view all collections. So basically, there's a way for us to look at these websites and sort of determine how we should spend time learning and using their website. In addition, you have, of course, the fact that they, other than Family Search, these are subscription websites, so you would have to have a subscription. They are also Family Search partner websites, and I'll mention that. One of the things that they have is the 1921 British Census, and this will be the last British census until 2051. That occurred because the 1931 census burned. The 1941 census was not held because of the war, and so it's not going to be until the 1951 census that the records are available. And then there's the time lapse of all the years they have to wait before that census is available. Okay, well, that's kind of Findmypast. It's very helpful. It's one of my go-to places, as I'll mention. It has key partnerships, which you might be aware of. One is the National Archives. That's not our National Archives, that's the British National Archives, and the British Library, and they have the British Newspaper Archive. Now, just as with our Ancestry, the newspaper collection is a separate subscription. So if you want to dig into British newspapers going back hundreds of years, you need to have a specific subscription to the British Newspaper Archive. Ancestry has newspapers.com, and MyHeritage, by the way, has designed their website to incorporate all their newspapers, which are in millions and millions of pages of newspapers on MyHeritage, including a substantial portion of the United States Library of Congress website for newspapers. And then there's the Family History Federation, which represents over 160 family history societies worldwide. This is a major website. And if you have any kind of British ancestors, and you're not looking at the website, then you're simply missing a whole lot of records. I've been doing some early English records just today and in the 1600s. And I'm using all 3 websites. I'm using Family Search, I'm using Ancestry, and Findmypast, because these are the ones that have kind of they're a little bit overlapping, but they have their own individual records. And by working with all 3 websites at once, you can often separate out and find information that is not obvious from looking at just one website. And as I mentioned, it's the go-to place for British research. That's where you go if you want to look at as much British research as there is available. And it's a family search partner. This means that members of the Church Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have a free subscription to this website. And that's due to the trade back and forth between these websites. Okay, so the history of this is that because Family Search is sponsored by the Church Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there has been some considerable friction on the part of any of the Catholic websites from sharing their records. There was a Pope a few years back who gave an edict that said, do not share your records with the Mormons. And basically, the only place in the world that followed that edict was the United States. But for whatever reason, it's continued, and there are very few Catholic records on Family Search dating back in history and forward in history from the colonial time. And that makes a problem because of some fairly obvious facts. But for whatever reason, Findmypast saw that as an opportunity and began negotiations with and began accumulating Catholic records, not just in the United States, but all over the British Isles. So right now, they have some of the oldest and best preserved records from the Catholic churches in Ireland. Of course, Ireland is a Catholic country, and that's important. And I have found that the Catholic archives open up a great amount of information that's been tremendously difficult to find from Ireland previously. So if you have Irish relatives, you certainly should be on Findmypast as well as on Ancestry.com and Family Search. Those are the three websites that will give you the best coverage of all of the British Isles, including Ireland. And now they are adding the Catholic records, and this interesting situation, and they have created that ongoing and constantly increasing records of various dioceses along the East Coast. So this is an ongoing project, and they announce new records weekly, actually, from Findmypast. Now, as I just was explaining, they negotiated this opportunity to digitize the records in the United States. And here's the list. Currently, this is pretty current list of 581 record sets. And you can see millions of records over here from different places, starting with a very large collection of the Ireland Roman Catholic parish baptisms and Roman Catholic parish marriages. So from that standpoint alone, this is a valuable website. Now, I'd say it's ongoing, meaning you're going to see a lot more records in the future as time passes. Now, why in the United States? Well, there are, and this is from the Catholic Directory in 2016, over 70 million registered Catholics in the United States, and that comprises 22% of the population. And so it is extremely likely that you have Catholic ancestors or Catholic relatives. Maybe not. Maybe your family has never married into the Catholic Church, or maybe your family started out as Protestants in Germany or in Scandinavia, for example, or from the Church of England. But going back far enough in time, you're basically going to run into at least some Catholic ancestors for a large portion of the United States. Now, I've done a couple of previous classes on not only just on the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church's organization. And why it's so important is because many of the countries of the world are predominantly Catholic. And I do a lot of Latin American research, and I act as a consultant for the Family History Library in Salt Lake through their system, which we're helping with here at the Brigham Young University Family History Library. And so I'm dealing with people from Italy and Spain and all of Latin America, and they are very, very predominantly Catholic. And so understanding how the Catholic Church is organized is essential. It's just to get the ideas, to find the records, and to understand how all those records are stored and where they're stored and how to find them is the one of the big challenges of doing only challenge actually of doing records in Latin America, because once you have the records, it's just a matter of going through and searching. If they're indexed, that's a bonus, but if they're not, you go through page by page and find ancestors. And many of the people I talk to come from very small communities, very small towns and parishes that have been in existence for hundreds of years. And it's very, very likely that everybody in the parish is related. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity for people who have ancestors in whatever part of the world in the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, in very short explanation, is organized geographically by membership. So when a membership in a certain area reaches a certain point, then they established a Catholic church, meaning they put up either a church or a cathedral where they could offer the Catholic services to their community. And the smallest denomination is, or smallest organization is the parish, and they vary in size, and they depend on whether they're out in the countryside or whether they're in the country. And the parish is the one who guides the parish is a parish priest. So the priest is in charge of parish. Now the parish can have more than one location. It's not one location. It could have separate churches. And the parish priest would then, in a sense, work with each of those individual churches and sometimes travel between the churches, performing ordinances like baptism and confirmations and marriages. The records themselves, however, are kept on the parish level. So you run into some kinds of interesting things, because sometimes the Catholic priest would take his notes and write them all down and then put them all into the parish register at the same time. So sometimes they're not quite as accurate as you would wish, but they're certainly more helpful than anything else we have. So that's very important. The next larger organization is called a diocese, and that's a group of parishes, and the head of the diocese is a Catholic bishop. And even though this is kind of a simplistic view, there's a lot of subdivisions and a lot of other kinds of relationships and organizations that go on within the church, the Catholic Church. So a diocese would be a larger geographical area, would have maybe as many as 20, 30 or more parishes. And basically, the importance of the diocese and the parishes is this, that the parishes generally keep the records at the level of the members of the Catholic Church, but the diocese backs that up every year, sort of church-wide. The bishop sends out a representative to the parishes. They either have the parish do a copy or they copy the records, and these are called bishop's transcripts in English. They have other names, obviously, in other countries, but this process gives you extra records in the Catholic Church. The diocese will also contain unique records. There's commandments in the Catholic Church against marrying too close relatives. In other words, if you're a first or second cousin, you probably have first cousins. You probably have a really difficult time getting married in the Catholic Church, and if you're a second cousin, you may still have a little bit of trouble, depending on what part of the world you live in. But that creates records, because the applications for people to get married who are close relatives go to the diocese. And those records can be extremely important because they contain entire pedigrees. They have to show how they're related if they want to get married and get an exception to it, in a sense. And then you have archdioceses, and the archdioceses have a cardinal, usually, And the cardinal, an archdiocese is a very large organization, I mean, very large geographic organization. And some countries, many countries, have just one archdiocese. In some of the more populous countries, there could be various archdioceses. To find all this and understand all this, there is an online website called the Catholic Directory. And the Catholic Directory has all sorts of churches, as all the churches. Now, there's www.catholicdirectory.com, but you may have better luck if you search in a specific country for the Catholic records. But this is in the United States, then you can start with this, and you'll find that it has a geographic search. So you can search for a church. Now, why is this important? We'll talk about that in just a few minutes, mainly for the reason that it may be necessary to contact the church directly if the records are not available online and easily obtainable. In the United States, we don't list religion. We have, and in many other countries. But because of that, it's challenging sometimes to determine what religion your ancestors had. One way, of course, is to search geographically. And if you find a location where they lived and you search around, it's arguably the first place you would look would be the closest, the churches that were physically closest to where your ancestors lived. And when you do the search for where they lived and you find a Catholic church and a parish, you can probably guess if they were Catholics, then there were members of that particular parish. And that's where they would have gone for their baptismal, marriage, and internment. What I should have mentioned is that the parish registers register baptisms or christenings, and that's the same, that's just two words for the same thing, and marriages and burials. The Catholic Church does not normally record, and it's rare, but happens occasionally, births. So you're not going to get a birth record out of a Catholic record, and you're not going to get a death record out of a Catholic record because those two are not recorded, but it's the christenings, the marriages, and the burials that are recorded. And that's just sort of general. And it also has kind of spilled over when during the, even in the Reformation, many of the Catholic procedures and policies and things were adopted by Protestant churches. And so some Protestant churches have followed that same kind of pattern. Don't generalize. This is just a caution, is you can't say that all Irish immigrants are going to be Catholic. They aren't. There's substantial Protestants, and part of the reason why we have Northern Ireland and Ireland as a Republic of Ireland as we have it today is because the Protestants who live in Northern Ireland who were predominantly Methodists and Presbyterians, to stay with Great Britain, and that caused a civil war that lasted many, many years, which was going on almost all the time I was growing up, as the Irish Republican Army and all of the Civil War issues were basically in the news. Now, if your family did come from a predominantly Catholic country, such as Spain or Latin America or some of the Southern European countries like Italy and others, then it's a pretty good guess that your family was Catholic. And at some point, even if they weren't Catholic when you grew up or when you knew your parents or grandparents, your ancestors who came over may have been Catholics. So you need to kind of take this into consideration when you're doing research going back, that there's a good chance that if they're from those countries, they're Catholics. Now we're going to get into looking at specifically at these records that came and how we look at the records here on Findmypast. Now, why would I choose this? Well, I gave the introduction about why Family Search doesn't have Catholic records for not too many. I don't know the reasons at all, but there are not a whole lot of Catholic records on Ancestry comparatively. Family Search has, and when I say that, it's about the United States. Family Search has the predominantly large collection of Catholic records for Latin America. There's the only other country, the only other website that has any records that are significant in Latin America is Ancestry, and they're confined mostly to Mexico. So Family Search and Ancestry have records for Mexico, but the rest of the country is not. Now, Findmypast has records that are predominantly from the United States and from the British Isles, just to repeat that. So that kind of differentiates how these different websites work out. So you can search individual record collections on Findmypast, and they have a link that gives you a way you can search for the records that exist by title and by category, and then you can go in and do a specific search on a specific website. Now, as opposed to, for instance, MyHeritage, where you would allow the company to do all the searching because they do a better job of it, Findmypast has a very, very useful and very helpful search engine, and it is easily the equal of any of the others, and in some ways easier to use and produces some very important information. So you can go in and cite, like this is my example here, looking at the Chicago Roman Catholic Cemetery records for 1864 to 1969. Now, what would you think about that? Now, if you go here, then you get this kind of thing. This is a search. And in this one, I just did a kind of a general search for a name to see. And what I would point out on this is, if you read the fine print down there, you'll see that this particular record came from Family Search. Now, if you don't find it on Family Search, and Family Search's index is not get to this particular record, for example, if it's not indexed on Family Search, then you may have the same record on Findmypast, only indexed and searchable. So this is another kind of way that these programs work together when you are trying to do research and you want to kind of avoid having to go through page by page through thousands of pages of records. So you might want to check this out, because this is another important thing. And when you're looking, you can see here, you get a considerable amount of information about the record. And in this case, it has the birth year, the burial year. It has the information, geographic information of where it was obtained. And then it has some very specific information about the film number, the record set, and all of the cataloging of the record. So these are important ways to look at it. Now, one thing I would suggest with Findmypast, and you can do this in other websites, but Findmypast has some unique features that make this concept of searching for records extremely useful. First of all, you can look in, like I've done here, in a specific reference by surname. Okay, so I have just searched this entire database by surname for Gomez, which I just used that as an example, but it happens that there are only 4 people. And if your guy was Gomez and he lived in and died in a Catholic cemetery in Philadelphia, for example, in this one, then you've just found him, because one of these 4 people was the only people that were buried in the Catholic cemeteries. This is the kind of things that when you start thinking in terms of what the capabilities of the search engine are for each of the websites. Now, if you were to do the same kind of search on Family Search, for example, even if you were searching a specific collection, first of all, it would have to have been indexed. And secondly, if you did a general search, you would probably end up with thousands and thousands of Gomez names, regardless of, even if they were all the only ones that were in Philadelphia were also listed. So there's some real differences here about how these all work. One other thing that it gives you is the frequency of the surname in the place you're searching. This is one of the most valuable parts of this, for giving you a mental concept of, in a sense, what you're up against when you begin searching for a specific name in a specific place. And it's very illustrative. So when you get to there, if you want to find the frequency on a specific place, say, for example, you look for how many people were born in the British Isles that had the name whatever. And then I'll show you how that works here in just a second. So you start with a general search. So I just put in Smith to give an example of what I mean by frequency. And if you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that there are over 42 million records. This is not the number of different individuals who are listed, but the frequency of the name Smith. So Smith appears in over 42 million records. So if you're looking for somebody named Smith, probably, unless you want to sit there and go through 42 million records, you're not going to find them without providing a lot more information. And here's the process. So I could put in a name. I can add a year of just any event in an ancestor's life. I can add the year of birth, and I can give or take up to 40 years, one way or the other. I can put in a year of death, and I can then specify, rather than the world, I can go specify exactly geographically where I'm looking. As I do that, then that number will drop because there'll be fewer people that fit all of the criteria that I've created, in a sense, filtering out all of the names that don't apply to the person I'm looking for. And in the case of the records, when you're searching for a very small place in England or someplace, generally speaking, the number of names that ends up coming up is very small. And here's an example of one. These people's last name is Yarkley, Yarkley. And if you look down at the bottom, there are only 31 results of Yarkley name in all of the records on Findmypast. And so basically, the conclusion I would have is that whoever it is that has the name Yarkley is related to all these people in the United States and in England. So here you've solved the problem. Where did your people come from? And you've also managed to see where these people live across the country. And that took one search, and it was simply by looking for a surname, one surname, and not even adding any qualifiers. So basically, this is kind of the power of this. Now, when you apply this to the Catholic Church records, obviously, that gives you a distinct advantage because you can start looking across international boundaries if you happen to have surnames that are somewhat unique, like this one is obviously a very unique surname. And it would be interesting to see where these people came from. You can see they do go back into the 1800s. It's very likely that they came from someplace else because there aren't any really old records here that have that surname. Also, if the records were digitized by Findmypast, then the original entries are viewable and downloadable. So when you're looking at the record, then you have this very good transcript. You can download the record, and you can, and the quality of the records is very, very good. They're not going to be any better than records that were microfilmed originally, but their digitized records are very easy to work with online, and it's a very advantage. Now, they're all there viewable and downloadable, except for records that come from the British General Register Office or the other government offices that charge for copies. So one thing you're going to find these very quickly in English research, and it doesn't matter if they're Catholics or Protestants or whatever, you're going to end up paying for an official copy or the complete copy of the record. Usually you can get an index copy, but you're in a sense going to have to spend a few bucks, pounds, to get either a digital or a paper copy. They'll mail you copies, but I would suggest you save your money and just get digital copies of the records. They're more expensive to mail, obviously. Now, Findmypast does have a family tree. So if you come, and they have very good record hints, and so it's helpful to build a tree with or have at least a tree on Findmypast. Now, it can get a little overwhelming when you start thinking about this, that you say, well, if I'm going to do a tree on Findmypast, and I'm going to do a tree on Ancestry, a tree on MyHeritage, I'm going to do a tree. No, The answer is you build your tree based on your research. So when you're researching and you need the record hints to help you with your research, then you work on that line and you put in a few names. So what I did today, and I do regularly, as my regular regimen in doing research in these records, is I have my basic tree starts with what I'm trying to work on in family search, and then I put everything into ancestry, and then I start looking into Findmypast, and that gives me the procedure, as I said earlier. You remember this, the United States was once a British colony, so they do have records that you would consider to be looking for. You'd think, well, I mean, they're Massachusetts, they're not in Massachusetts. Well, yeah, they might be in England too, because all the government things were in England. And so you do also keep in mind the jurisdictional and historical things that have happened over the years, the changes in boundaries, the changes in who owned the countries and who ran the countries and who owned, where the records were being kept, is one of the challenges of doing research in genealogy, because the records change locations and move from one place to another. There's a general rule of genealogy that records move, and they move from place to place. So even though this was Salem, Essex, Massachusetts in 1651, these are technically English records. And so there are records corresponding, helpful records that may exist in England. And the same thing with the Catholic records. Even though they may be United States Catholic records, they do go back into the earlier days, into colonial days. And once again, they become records. And if you know some history of Great Britain and all of the things that have gone on there, you realize that there was in 1538, Henry VIII cut off the Church of England from the Catholic Church. And so you're basically back to 1538 or parish registers. And before that, there are none. But at the same time, the Catholic Church was still present, and although persecuted and had some difficulties back and forth, there's still Catholics in England and the rest of the British Isles. Just as a point, Findmypast keeps track of all the records you view. So you have kind of a running commentary of all your searches. So you can see the searches that I'm making on the different dates as I work on different lines. And so that's the kinds of things that are helpful here. And then you can also go back to each record that you looked at. So there's a running way to look at each of those records. There are some helps. There is a blog, and you can look for that. And it basically tells you it's a go-to guide for researching Catholic ancestors. Their goal is to add as many as 100 million Catholic records published online for the first time ever. And that's literally true. These records have never been previously online. They're not being borrowed from anybody, and they're being originally digitized by Findmypast. So they're extremely valuable to genealogists who have not had this availability previously. You can also find helpful resources on the Findmypast YouTube channel. All of the major genealogical websites have YouTube channels, and they all have videos talking about their programs and explaining and teaching. And so they're quite interesting, and they're a good way to get some overview real quick of how these programs work and how they're maintained. And I'm emphasize again that Findmypast has records from all the former British Empire countries while they were in the empire. The records were being kept. And so some of these interesting places that you would think, well, why would there be records from, wherever? And where would I go to look for them? Well, one of the things you may want to try to remember is to do your history, go back looking historically for how things happened and how the changes. Obviously, if you look at this old map of Africa with the names of the British empires, you'll see that the names on the map, except for a few, are now completely different. And there's not a northern and southern Rhodesia and Tanganyika, and some of the other countries no longer exist as such, and they have different names. And it's continuing, by the way, the name changes on countries. And fortunately, here in the United States, we're also going through name changes presently on a lot of cases. We had some local name changes here in Utah for the last few days for geographic locations in the state. I think that's pretty much sums it up. I know we're getting through a little bit early here. This was not intended to be a long exposition. Let me kind of summarize here at the end. First of all, in the United States, this is a newly opened door to records. In other words, these records have not been available in digitized form, generally speaking, outside of going to a Catholic diocese or parish and looking at the records directly. And now they're being digitized and put online and made available through Findmypast. So that's the big news. And then the secondary part of that is that there are some real advantages to using the Findmypast website for any research, Catholic or otherwise, that goes on in the British Isles. And these are both very important points to understand. Okay, well, I know I've been in early for a real change of speed for me, but
James, we have some questions you may want to answer.
sure.
Here. Can you export from Family Search your tree to Findmypast?
No. Presently, Family Search has no way to export a file, like a JEDCOM file, which would be the way to do that. On the other hand, if you have your family tree on Ancestry or Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest or one of the other programs, yes, you can download a JEDCOM file and then upload that to Findmypast. I am not a fan of exporting and importing large amounts of data for using JEDCOM. And the reason why I think there should be a caution there is because you're picking up information that you, first of all, may not have personally added. You may be picking up information that has little or no source support, and you may be adding in duplicates into any other place where the records already exist. So JEDCOM files are convenient in a way, but they have their limitations when you start uploading into large online websites like this. I think it's much more valuable to use a way I mentioned about researching is when I start to do research on a line that's in England, then I go into the website and build that part of the family tree. I do that only if it's indicated. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not helpful. And if it doesn't turn out to be helpful along that line, then if I'm not getting record hints, for example, popping up when I put that information in, then I probably will wait to not do that and just use the search mechanism most of the time. So that's kind of one process, one kind of thing you have to do. Anything else? What else?
Maria asks a number of questions. Is there a tool or class to help read the Catholic baptismal, etc. records from the Philippines? It's not the Spanish that's a challenge for me, but the handwriting style and notations. I think she also says Latin America also when I go there.
Handwriting is always going to be a challenge, and it's not just a handwriting because of older handwriting styles, but because individuals each had their own characteristics, unique characteristics in their handwriting. The process is don't try to jump back. Don't jump back into the 1600s and immediately think that that's going to be something you want to do. I would work back systematically. As you do that, you'll get more and more experience reading the handwriting that's fully legible if there is any, in 1900s and 20th and 19th century. So basically, if you get back into 1800s, then handwriting styles begin to change as you go back in time, and it gets more difficult. There are tutorials online for learning how to read the handwriting. BYU has script tutorials. Just look up BYU script, SCRIPT, and you'll come up with the BYU script tutorials. And they're very useful to go through if you need that. But it's something you have to learn. And yes, there are tools and classes, like I said, from BYU and other places for teaching this language. But it is a language issue too, because as you go back in time in all Catholic records, eventually you start to see more and more Latin. So you're going to have to know some Latin terms. One good thing about Spanish records and parish records is they're almost uniformly in the same format across all of the Catholic Church. So if you look at a parish register in English, assuming you're looking at one in English or in a language you know, and you find one it's not in a language you don't know, it probably has exactly the same information because it's like a form they filled out when they did the writing. It had to conform to their form. The form does change over time. There's more information in later years than there was back. As going back in time, you always end up with less.
Are all findmypast.com uploaded trees public? And can you search for matches in other submittal trees? And finally, someone asked, so Findmypast is primarily a British focused app?
Yes, yeah, you'd have to characterize it as that. But you have to understand when I said the implication of what I said when I said it has records from the entire former British Empire. So you can go there and do searches for Australia, New Zealand, and even current records, anything that any of the countries that are members of the Commonwealth and any of the previous countries who were part of the British Empire. We have missionaries, at least one that I know very well at BYU Family History Library, whose ancestors came from India. And that's where she finds all her records, is on Findmypast. Of course, the British occupation of India. What else do we have? Can you contact the BYU and get help from me further? Yes, definitely. All you have to do is click in and ask. It might be a good idea to get an appointment because I'm there only on Monday nights right now and from 4 to 8.
But that of coordinators there all the time. And we
Yes.
could be a go-between to set up an appointment with Elder Tanner to help you on those types of questions. And there's no, unlike other places, we have no limitations on how many minutes you spend with us. So we're always eager to try to help you with whatever issue you may have.